Well, with that, I would like to introduce the moderators of this panel. And they happen to be two of my favorite journalists in the world. And if you're not reading everything they write all the time, you're really, really missing out. And it's Christopher Hooks and Erica Grieder. I think I might just let you all take it away and introduce the rest of our panelists, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I really want to note, too, thank you all so much for joining us. Between the journalists and the legislators, we're right in the heat of it right now in the session, and for them all to be here with us is really saying an awful lot. So we really appreciate you all making the time.
Well, thank you. I'll go ahead and introduce our three of our four panelists. To start, to the left, or to your right, is former State Representative Curtis Graves, who was a member of the Dirty 30 and subsequently went on to a 30-year career at NASA and then became a photographer, which seems like a great professional trajectory. And then to his right, State Senator Sylvia Garcia, Democrat from Houston, and to her right, State Representative Trey Martinez Fischer, Democrat from San Antonio. So thank you all for being here. And just two small notes. We're supposed to have a fourth panelist, Jim Dunham, who's been held up en route, so he might just arrive midway through. And then TMF over here has to leave at about 4:15. So at that point, we'll switch to audience questions. If you have any questions for him, just throw up a hand early, and we'll make sure we get to that. So I thought we'd start, Representative Graves, by asking you for your perspective on this, and for kind of your personal version of this, since you were in the ledge since '69.
Well, I want to thank Sissy for inviting me, and I'm thinking, as the 2 days have rolled on, that this has been one of the highlights of my life to see her receive this kind of honor. And I'm learning more about you, Sissy, than I ever knew existed. I would be remiss if speaking at a law school if I didn't tell one personal story. I probably am the only person in the room who can say that Thurgood Marshall slept in his bed. I divide time into BI and AI. Most people go BC and AD, and I go BI and AI, before integration and after integration. Well, before integration, when lawyers came to town to defend cases, they stayed with the family. And the prominent civil rights attorney in New Orleans was a guy named A.P. Turo. There's a book about him if you are interested in him and his legal work. You can get that from Amazon. Well, A.P. brought this tall, light-skinned guy to my house, and I guess I must have been 6 or 7. And he stayed overnight, and then I think he stayed over the second night, and then went away. And I never thought that much about it. I remember him being funny, and he didn't know he was Thurgood Marshall at the time. Years passed, and he was a sitting justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. My dad called and said, "Remember when he came to our house?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You were maybe 6, 7 years old, tall, light-skinned guy, was funny, loved your mom's cooking." And I said, "I don't remember that." He said, "You slept on the sofa and he slept in your bed." And I said, "Now I remember." Well, about a year or two later, Wally Branton, who was another civil rights attorney from Arkansas, passed away. And I went to the funeral because I known Wally, and Thurgood was there. And I walked up to him and introduced myself and told him who my father was. And I said, "You spent a couple of nights at my house." And he said, And I said, "Let me tell you again who my dad is." And I told him, and he said, "Man, your mama could cook." And I said, "What do you mean could? She's still cooking." He said, I got to find a way to get to New Orleans. He said, I remember that food. She could cook. Well, that's my personal story. The other one, the other thing is that Sissy mentioned yesterday about standing on a table in the legislature back when we had the press table there in the middle of the House floor. It was a special session. Special sessions, if you don't know what a special session is, it's always a license for the governor to steal, because you have to have a call of the special session, and if you wanted the call increased, you came up with a suitcase full of money and you gave it to the governor, and the governor increased the call to include your legislation. Well, it was a special session for revenue, and Bill Heatley and his people had drafted a bill to tax food in the state. And during the morning session, the bill was to be debated in that afternoon. During the morning session, there was a bomb scare, and the building was cleared. And the Capitol Police went through the building to make sure everything was all right. But the problem is, whenever you cleared the building, most of the legislators went to the local bar and got drunk. And I would say when we reconvened 2 o'clock or so, you could have had 60, 70 drunk people in the room. And Sissy and I were sober. And Heatley was presenting his bill at the front mic, and I took the back mic in opposition to taxing food. And I was in the middle of my presentation, and I heard right behind me somebody say, "Shut the nigger up." And as I turned, I think it was Bob Vail who swung and hit somebody. And I said, damn, I better get out of here. So I picked up the microphone, because they were going to stop me from speaking. I picked up the microphone, made one step on the chair and the other step on top of the table, and finished my remarks on top of the table. Well, by that time, there were people on the floor behind me. I mean, it had gotten really ugly. Well, I wasn't about to get off on that end of the table. I walked all the way to the other end of the table and got off on that end. And we defeated that provision in the bill. So I think you still don't have, a food tax. So it was a unique time in the history of Texas when all of those things were occurring. Like Sissy, I introduced some bills that caused some strange reactions. I think I'm still the only person to have fired a gun on the floor of the House. As a matter of fact, I made 2 shots.
Open carry, you might brace yourself.
Yeah.
It may get repeated.
I made 2 shots, as a matter of fact. But the second shot, there wasn't a damn person in the room. After the first shot, they were laying on the floor. I introduced the bill during that same special session. You had to have revenue involved in the legislation that you would introduce. So I introduced a bill that would charge $10 for a license to own a gun in the state of Texas. So this was a revenue-raising bill. And I got Bob Johnson, legislative counsel, to draft this great bill for me. And the day of that, my hearing before the committee, I dressed meticulously in a white suit with white shoes and white socks and a black tie. Because I wanted to make a statement that day. And I had a shoemaker, because it's difficult to find a left-hand shoulder holster. I had a shoemaker to make me a left-handed shoulder holster. So I had it done in black because I wanted it to be seen. So I showed up on the floor of the House that morning with my pistol in my shoulder holster. Of course, it wasn't loaded, but I wanted it known that I was wearing a gun. So the whisper was around, the niggas carrying a gun. And I was happy with that, because that's the point I wanted to make. So that 2 days before, I had gone to the Austin Police Department and gotten two pistols, one of which had been bought from a pawn shop on Congress about 3 blocks from the Capitol. And the other one was just a pistol that was involved in a murder. Both pistols had been, the cases had been gone through, and they were just pistols there. So they loaned me these 2 guns. I bought blanks for one of them. And in the middle of my presentation about my bill and how this was going to raise so much money for the state, and this was a good thing, and the only 2 prohibitions against owning this license was you could not be adjudicated insane, or you couldn't be a felon. So if you were a felon or adjudicated insane, you couldn't get a license to have a gun in the state of Texas. But once you got the license, you could buy 100 guns, but you would be registered. People would know who you were. So in the middle of my presentation, I had sitting on the table, that same press table, a brown paper bag, and I opened the paper bag, and I reached down and I pulled out this pistol that I had loaded with the blanks. And I said, you know, this morning, if you said something on the floor of the House that angered someone, they could walk out of this Capitol building, walk 3 blocks down the street on the left to that pawn shop that sold guns, and buy this gun for $25. For 50 cents more, the pawn shop owner will load it for you for 50 cents more. And at the time, there were many cases where the pawn shop owner would load a gun for 50 cents and then be held up by the same gun that he had just sold the guy. Okay? Well, I said the person could go down there for 50 cents more, get this gun loaded, come back to the Capitol, and I fired it one time. You would be dead. And then I fired the second time. Well, by the time I got the second shot off, there wasn't a soul standing in the room but me. And I had cleared the floor, but I made my point. And then I pulled out the second gun and told them about its history. And obviously, I didn't even get honorable mention. But I got hate mail from as far away as Australia because the National Rifle Association had made this a cause célèbre, and they wanted to make sure that everybody knew that this kind of bill that just registered people, and after that you could buy as many guns as you wanted, that just registered people so that at least the state would know who had the guns. Not something that will happen in Texas for a long, long, long time, because I think you have open carry now, and if you're a legislator, you don't even have to walk through the metal detectors, you walk around it. Where are we going to go? There was a couple more bills that I introduced during that time, as well as being maybe the session before Sissy came. I was the known radical, and I think it was that session where I introduced a black history bill, because the history book that was being used by the state of Texas for elementary schools, the only reference to slavery was one picture on one page that had a black guy on the north end of a southbound mule pushing a plow. And that was the only reference to slavery in the whole book. So I said we should change the history books to reflect this awful time in the history of our nation. And obviously that bill didn't get out also. But the bad part about this is that I found out through the research that I had done with reference to that bill is that the state of California and the state of Texas determines what the history books are for the whole nation. And it's because of those two states that history books are designed. So all of those years and years since, the history books have been distorted because of what the Texas Book Commission and the California Book Commission will determine to be books that can be used in the state. I introduced another radical bill that would ban the use of DDT. And if you think the yahoos would come out for the gun thing, you'd be surprised the yahoos that came out in support of DDT. I mean, the chamber was full with legislators who brought bags of DDT so that they could run their fingers through it like Pillsbury flour to say that without DDT, we cannot grow our crops and people will starve in the nation. And now we know what DDT has done, and there was a piece on television within the last few days that I saw what DDT has done to the pelican population in Louisiana. And they're still suffering from the DDT because their eggs wouldn't harden. Consequently, they couldn't reproduce. So it was fun times back in those days. And being a part of the Dirty 30 and being introduced to Sissy and flying around in that plane with her that we were talking about was a great, great, great opportunity. So that's my remarks.
So, Senator Garcia, I hate to ask you to top that, but
You're right, it's probably more fun to listen to his stories.
I think their stories are the same these days as in the Ledge. It sounds like similar themes being discussed.
So I see you came with a pen. As you were growing up in Texas and thinking about a life of public service, what did this period of the legislature mean to you?
Well, for me, it meant a lot, and it started with Sissy because, for those of you who don't know, I'm not originally from Houston. I actually grew up in a small farming community called Palito Blanco, which is in South Texas, and the closest television station was Corpus Christi, so we were in their viewing area. So I used to watch on TV when she was in the legislature. Actually, I used to see her on TV when she was the fighting legal aid lawyer that she was. And I would hear Gene Looper, who was the newscaster then, but Francis Sissy Farenthold filed a lawsuit today trying to blah, blah, blah. Or then later in the legislature, Francis Sissy Farenthold filed a bill to help the migrant workers. So I used to see that on TV and think, I kind of like that. Maybe someday I'll grow up to be a lawyer. I never really thought that I would run for office or be in office. I hadn't really connected all that. But she was somebody that I connected with because I saw it on TV. And for me, it didn't matter that I was Hispanic and she wasn't, or that because she was out there fighting, quite frankly, always for the people who had the least voice, the most vulnerable, and the people that needed a fighter. And that's what I connected with. Then when I got to Texas Women's University, I saw her again when I was in Denton, and lo and behold, I was involved in politics then, and the Denton County Party called me and said, Sylvia, we've got the gubernatorial candidate coming, and I said, great. So I was like there in a heartbeat. So I still have my little Sissy button, and I have my little Sissy bumper sticker. That, George, I don't know why we made these, but they were great for the bicycles. I think this is one of these that we should bring back because I think we have more bicycles now than we did then. But I got involved with her campaign, and in fact, we had a symposium at TW that I was kind of organizing as I was involved with student government, and we had Gloria Steinem come to our campus. And coincidentally, it was when Sissy was coming to campaign. So I said to Gloria, wouldn't it be great if we got you and Sissy Farenthold together? And she said, who's Sissy Farenthold? And that's when we made the calls to try to make sure that they connected, and they connected in the Dallas area in a hotel because we wanted to make sure that these two great women leaders got together. So for me, it was always about involvement and making a difference. And obviously, I did become a legal aid lawyer, just like Sissy Farenthold did. And I also now, of course, am in the legislature just like she was. But I can tell you that for me, I've seen her while I was in college. I saw her, and I still have my button when I wore the Texas Women's Political Caucus button when she was named president of the National Women's Political Caucus, and we cannot forget that. We were there fighting for the ERA. I still have that button, and I was on the floor when the big ERA fight was here in Texas. I was, well, I wasn't a baby, but I may have been a law student. So I've been part of this, and I was around when she was there struggling and working with us with the farm workers. I've got my boycott lettuce button. So some things haven't changed. The buttons can still be used today, because this is, we can all talk to Jessica Farrar. This one says abortion and women's rights to choose, and it's from a NOW convention from years back. And regretfully, it's still about guns, and it's still about fight for equality. It's still about fights for reproductive freedom. And for us Hispanics, TMF, we're fighting. And it's more fights than just grapes. It's about our kids going to college. It's about education. It's about health care. It's about this nonsense about stopping us and asking us for papers. So the fight continues, Sissy, but I'm just glad you were there on TV for me to watch you.
Representative Martinez Fischer, you're a bit younger,
Yes.
perhaps, although not as young as Chris and I. How did you experience this legacy when you were a young guy in politics?
Well, the truth of the matter is that 1972 election, I was 2 years old, and when I was elected to the legislature in 2000 and arrived in 2001, I had the good fortune of making some friends, and Paul Moreno of El Paso and Edno Rangel were giants to me when I started my career. And I remember one of the first two lessons that I learned in my first term. The first one was from Paul, who told me that if you could get 30 votes together, you had some power in the legislature. And he talked to me about the Dirty 30, and he told me about times when he and Tom Craddock were both members of the Dirty 30. And then he also encouraged me, along with others, to get familiar with the rule book, because if you knew the rules, you also had a voice. And so I think that shaping my legislative career, being able to whip votes and being able to exert influence through the use of the rule book, it sort of shaped my path. And it's just amazing to see how these influences come together. And before, we get on to my story, I think it's what's absolutely just so amazing about Senator Garcia's story is that, the role model that she had and how it empowered her, and to know that, several years later, one person had the guts to vote against a budget in the Senate that didn't work for our constituents. And so, it all makes sense to me as I start to listen. I listen from one decade to another, about how the fight really hasn't changed so much. The chairs may have shifted, and people are dressed nicer, and it's a different. We use different technology, but really the fundamentals are still there. And so I think it's important in terms of how I see my job on a day in and day out basis. I think that one of the tools and things that I want to think about is how do you incorporate these learning lessons into the fights that we have today, and also pay it forward for the folks, that are a little bit younger than me in seniority, that will be around and be that next generation of leadership. And so, we've always had these legislative giants, and I know that I have the occasion to run into Babe Schwartz from time to time. And he would tell me, about, why we as Texas Democrats, why don't we do more to punish our own? Why don't we, have that tough love with our members to make sure that they are holding the line on key votes? And I know that, some of the discussion today might talk about our voting patterns and how we may have drifted away from some of the democratic-based values that we've always have fought for. But I think that, having that connectivity, and maybe to, answer your initial question, is that how does it shape, the way I think, and how has it impacted my career? I think that, honestly, I should say, well, I wish I had the foresight to sort of learn from that more on my own. I'm very fortunate and grateful that I had the opportunity to learn it as I grew into legislative leadership with the members that were still present on the floor, but to know, like, to be able to take a time trip and to understand, what it means to fight and why we fight and who we fight for, and to be able to say that in 2015 we still have to go to the federal courthouse for voting rights. We still have to go to the courthouse to make sure that people have the opportunity to vote for candidates of their choice. That we still have to go to the courthouse to say that it's okay for every child to receive a good education. And so I think that if the more that we actually have these lessons, I think the easier it becomes to answer Babe's question, which is how do you keep your caucus together when you have so many temptations, whether they be temptations to pass your individual agenda, temptations to say yes to special interests, temptations to play the get along to go along. I think it's times like this, and just like we saw yesterday on the House floor, nobody cared about a state agency receiving a review through a sunset bill. Of course, it had to pass. Of course, it had to be good legislation. But for the most part, you could have just slept through the debate. But when you attach some very divisive red meat wedge issues, and you still want to have a discussion about women's reproductive rights, all of a sudden it took on a different flavor. But then when the debate turned to a male member refusing to yield for questions of not just a female member of the legislature, but a woman who is respected in the subject matter and knows more about this subject matter and has probably forgotten more than I'll ever learn on the subject matter. To deny her an opportunity to engage in a debate that we are all elected to do, to me, that just, that's when we cross the Rubicon. And what I want to take away from Representative Graves, I made a few notes. I've never stood on a table before. I've done a lot of things. I've broke quorum. Yeah. I know, but they're still there. There's still one there. And so, I've turned the front mic around on the speaker and addressed him directly. I've done a few things, but when that happened, that was a moment where Texas Democrats had to say, damn it, we may not be much, but we're all you got. And we showed our solidarity with Jessica on that front mic, and then I went on the back mic and took down the agency for about an hour until we could get a level of respect, a level of attention, and some sort of accommodation that we weren't going to put up with those kinds of things on an agency review bill. And so, I'm glad that I'm in good company. I think I'm still learning. My fear is that I may want to learn too much, and I don't know if this current legislature with open carry and so forth, it could be a dangerous proposition for me.
Well, let me ask maybe one more question about the historical context. Looking back at Texas modern political history, I see the 72 elections as a seminal moment. That's when the state starts to change from a set of people who'd held power for a long time to a new set, a different party comes into power. But the Dirty 30 had been organizing or coalesced for several years prior and talking about the issues, corruption, insiders controlling politics for the benefit of insiders. In the case of the 60s legislature, straight up bribes and worse. But it seems like that crystallized with the Sharpstown scandal, which directly implicated several of the statewides and kind of corroborated what you guys have been warning about for years. So if not for Sharpstown, what would have happened, do you think?
I really don't know, but if not for Sharpstown helped us to focus really what the problem was. And somebody whispered to me that Ben Barnes had said, damn fools, they took stock instead of money. Because that was the first time that somebody had taken stock, which was traceable, and everybody else took straight up money. If you didn't have the money, you paid to play. But I'm now worried more than ever about what has happened to our democracy. From coast to coast, state to state, ALEC has found a way to creep its way into every legislative process to get redistricting done in a way that changes the legislative landscape as well as the congressional landscape. And we are now at a point where money can control any election in the nation. And I don't think that our democracy has ever seen that before. I remember going to a black legislative caucus. I guess it must have been '69. The NAACP had called together some black legislators, and we met in Washington. And I remember listening to Senator Johnson from Georgia, Leroy Johnson, and others in the legislation that they were introducing in their legislatures, and putting some of those things into legislation that I was going to be introducing in Texas. But that was kind of a one-on-one thing. Now it has been so well organized by Koch money until every state in the union is being touched by the corruption of big money. They can find an ideological ideologue whose subject might be core curriculum, or it might be guns, or it might be women's reproductive rights, or it might be religious freedom. We want the freedom to discriminate against anybody who we don't like, or it might be whatever those right-wing issues are. They find that person who could normally not get elected, and they dump tons of money behind that person and get them elected. They have no interest in governance whatsoever. They have only interest in that agenda, which might be guns or whatever. And they will do whatever they want to do, because the Koch brothers have really two agendas. We don't want to pay any taxes, and we want all of the environmental regulations in the nation to go away. And that all has to do with the dollar. Well, we're in a sad state in our nation when we've allowed our politics to be corrupted to this extent.
So, I wanted to touch on something Representative Martinez Fischer said a second ago. Senator Garcia, the other week, you had the distinction of casting the only no vote on Dan Patrick's budget plan, a bill which is not well liked by Democrats. And I won't ask you, I guess, to speculate why the other Democrats in your caucus voted yes on that bill. But why do you think it was important for you to do that? And I guess why don't other people in your chamber feel the same?
Well, for me, it was simple. It just wasn't a good budget. I think a lot of folks tried to talk me out of it, including the lieutenant governor. He called me up to talk to him and try to get me not to, and I'll be real open about it. I said, you promised not to put sanctuary cities and the Dream Act on the floor, and maybe I'll reconsider. He said, well, no, I can't do that. I campaigned on that. I said, well, guess what? I campaigned on fully restoring the cuts to education. I campaigned on health care, Medicaid expansion. I campaigned on pre-K for all kids. And I went through my list. I said, so can't do it. So for me, it was about my district. It was about the things that I believe in. And if that wasn't in the budget, then I just wasn't going to vote for it. So it wasn't really that hard for me to conclude that I wasn't going to do it. I think when we visited with you, a day or two before, I'd already shared with you that those were my plans. Regrettably, I had heard from some of my colleagues that those were their plans, but they chose to not do that. And you're right, we can't speculate what they did or didn't. We've got to respect their vote, and I voted for my district and my conviction, and end of story.
For Senate Democrats, at least, this is in some ways the least powerful that they've ever been because of the rule changes that were passed this session,
Right.
because of other factors. And but that hasn't necessarily translated into more unity in the caucus.
No, and it is disheartening, and I can tell you, being one of 11 is not easy, but it's hard to keep that 11 together. And I think that there's a lot of factors, it's people's district needs, it's people's, own agendas, it's people's position on either committees or old alliances. I mean, many of those members are more senior than I am. So I think it's, everybody's got their own moral compass, everyone's got their own principles, and we all have to kind of, deal with that. Again, for me, it's always just been trying to do the right thing, and, when you've got a role model like Sissy Farenthold that you watch on TV, fighting all the time and fighting for poor people and the unrepresented, it makes it easier. It does not mean that we weren't the House will not do better in getting some stuff, and they did do that. They funded education a little bit better, pre-K and a number of other things. I'm hopeful that the conference committee can make it a better budget, and I'll look at it again, but I'm going to use my same criteria, and if it doesn't meet my test, I'll vote against it.
Can I ask the corollary question to Representative Martinez Fischer? You voted for the House budget, which was about $2 billion smaller overall for the forthcoming biennium, but I thought, in my opinion, at least a much more well-constructed budget, and depending on which issues you're looking at, created some more funding for certain things, less for others. Every Democrat, including you, voted for that. The only no votes on the House side were from 5 Tea Party type representatives. So can you get any comments on?
Sure. I imagine the Tea Party no votes probably had more to do with they thought the budget was spending too much. And so it was a protest vote that we were spending too much money. As far as Democrats coming along and voting with it, I mean, there were some things that needed serious consideration. It was a plan that spent $1 billion more in schools than what the Senate was proposing. It was taking a proposal to put an additional $1.5 billion into transportation funding of general revenue when the competing policy from the Senate at that time was to take a diversion of the motor vehicle sales tax for future general revenue, saying, okay, well, can we spend the $1.5 billion now because we have it in the bank, or are we going to, divert it from future budgets, therefore, maybe preventing us from having resources for whether it's schools or healthcare or so forth. So, but it's also a reflection, too, of, I think, a different dynamic that's going on in the House, and I say this with, tremendous respect to the Senate. I mean, I completely respect the Senate and the senators and spend a lot of time, even to this day, working with members of the Senate. But the role reversal of the Texas House this time, the operating procedure in the past was we raised all the hell, enough to get Senator Garcia's attention, get Senator Ellis's attention, so it gave them the alert, there's trouble coming. They use the 2/3 rule to block it, and then they fix it. Senate takes the credit, the House gets the assist. That's sort of the operating procedure. With the rule changes now, it's one of these things where I think the House still has to raise the hell, but then we have to stop and pivot and say, okay, now wait a minute, who's going to fix this? I mean, is Dan Patrick going to let the senators, work their will? Or do we have a better shot, trying to have a shared interest in getting it done in the House? And so I think we find ourselves both, spotting the issues, but also trying to be part of the solution when we can, but not losing our navigation system when it's time to put our foot down. Now, we haven't done it perfectly. I'll be honest with you. I think our Democrat caucus has strayed from some votes where they shouldn't have. But I think that, part of that, if I could address that, part of that has more to do with the fact that I think that members are sort of wrestling between that notion of being feared or being loved. And I just sort of say, well, I'm loved at home, so that's where I go to get my love. And when I go to the Capitol, I'd rather be feared. And I'd rather take positions on policy and vote no. I took a border security bill that I did not like. I amended it twice and voted no. I took a public integrity bill that I did not like. I amended it 4 times and voted no. And I remember the leadership coming up to me and they said, Team F, are you okay? I said, I'm great. And they said, well, we took your amendments. Yeah, thank you. Well, you voted no. And I was like, well, did anybody ask me to vote yes? I mean, no one asked me to vote yes. I mean, did you think I was actually going to vote for it? And they said, well, no, I guess we never thought of that. And I said, well, look, and the joke on the floor is that, Trey is less likely to kill a bill that he amends. And so they said, so if we take your amendment, you're less likely to kill a bill that you just changed. I'm like, yeah, of course. We'll take the amendment. We're okay with the amendment so that, we don't have to deal with a rules fight. And so I think that it's sort of like getting, our caucus to recognize better, and we do a good job, but we can always improve, but to get our caucus to recognize it is okay to make principled decisions and say, okay, well, I've got something on there that makes it a little bit better, but the overall piece of legislation is bad, therefore I vote no. And I think that is something that we are struggling with, because I think folks feel like if you play nice, you've got to vote that way, and we've seen that happen a couple of times this session already.
So,
And for us, let me just add, since I'm just going to react to somebody, for us, it was, they won't even take any of our amendments, and any that we offered, and obviously not on the budget, but even on other bills. I mean, it goes down 20 to 11 on every single one. On the gun bill, we must have introduced 20 amendments. They all went down 20 to 11, 20 to 11. So we keep the fight, but we know the end result. And for me, the other thing that I forgot to mention is that, as I said on before, I mean, we can't find money for Medicaid expansion. We can't find money for pre-K. We can't find money for this. We're making poor people poor, quite frankly. But we miraculously find $845 million for more border security. So where are our priorities? I stick with the people. Thank you.
I see a hand in the audience, a question for...
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for this panel. In 1973, the Texas legislature with Curtis Trey and Sissy Farenthold passed the model penal code of ALI. We amended a little bit with the passage. Now we are wringing our hands and talking about ALEC and the power it has. Well, ALI is still there. ALI could be a counterbalance to ALEC if it were utilized. I mean, an inspirational legal organization that changed the criminal codes in every state of the union in 10 years is not small potatoes. And if you want to change the gerrymandering of ALI, if you want to change the other ALI procedures, get national help. Look at this in the macrocosm. Senator, I love you like a sister. You need help to accomplish your honest goals. Mr. Representative?
sir, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Take advantage. My advantage is, what plans do you have for counterbalancing ALI? I mean, ALEC.
Yeah,
You get a lot of help from the National Security.
No, that's a fair question. When I first came into the chamber in 2001, there was a group, Center for Policy Alternatives, which was a progressive left-wing group that was funded, and then someone named George W. Bush was elected president, and that funding went away, and it was unpopular to give to progressive causes. And so you see ALEC, which is very bound and determined to do things one way. NCSL tries to be, the Henry Kissinger of legislative diplomacy, where they want to include everyone, so you're not going to get the counterbalance. But I was encouraged to see a group called Project 6. I encourage you to take a look at Project 6, which is a group now that's receiving left-wing funding, is receiving funding by the Democracy Alliance, and what their single and sole mission in life is to counteract ALEC. And I think it's equipped with some good folks who have just left the White House, the current White House. It's been funded with some good money from the West Coast, with really good intentions. And I was impressed to see them in the state capitol already. And so I think, something like that deserves a little time to mature. But, I agree with you, but I think that there are folks out there that obviously aren't looking for the recognition or not out there to market their wares. but folks have not forgotten on the left wing, how to fight, and I am never without an arsenal of material and information and resources from progressive groups when I need to take that mic.
Well, let me ask about that and how this experience has changed in the past 40-some years. When the Dirty 30 was operational, or when you were in the legislature, there was the stated purpose was to be for good government, for common sense government for the people, cutting across party lines, ideological lines, liberals and conservatives. And then today the discussion seems framed in a much more partisan, polarized way. Is that fair to say? Do you think that's troubling? Is that a self-perpetuating trend? Or do you still see the division as between serious people who are trying to do serious policy and people who are not serious playing politics?
There's a big fault line between the two. And back in our day, Sissy, I think that my last session, there were 3 Republicans. And they voted with us most of the time because they were opposed to what that really right-wing group was doing in the state. And now it's a different ball game altogether. And if any of their members don't toe the line, they punish them. I mean, they'll run somebody against them if they don't toe the line. And I guess Babe Schwartz is right. We need to find ways to punish those people who are not doing what they ought to be doing with reference to the progressive agenda. I don't like to say left-wing anymore. I say progressive because I think left-wing gives it all kinds of funny connotations, even internationally. But progressive might be the best way to define where I am.
Well, that I guess can go both ways, and we'll take some more.
Well, I do think that it is more partisan now in end result in the Senate, at least. But the divisions are really in 3 because there's the Tea Party, clique is what I call it, and then there's the regular Republicans, the double R's, and then there's the Democrats. So, but the end result is that the pressure is still put on the regular Republicans to vote because there's a fear of being primaried next time. And there's also the fear of what happened to Senator Estes when he voted against the change on the 2/3 rule. So I think the dynamics are different. And I was quite surprised because I did think there was rumors that there was going to be, I think, 2 or 3 of them that were not going to vote for the budget. But, they were called in and they lined up.
2 or 3 of the Republicans.
Mm-hmm. Because I remember when Sarah Nelson came to me right before we got on the floor, she said, "Oh my gosh, you're going to be my only one." And I said, "Well, wait a minute, what happened to?" And I, gave it this, says, "Oh no, they're not voting for it." And then when I visited with those members, they told me personally that they had been visited by, they had visits with Lieutenant Governor.
And, to me, it's shocking because this is partly informed reporting and partly speculation, but I think apart from Senator Nelson, I don't think there was another single strong yes vote for the budget in the Senate. I think there were a lot of qualms on both sides of the aisle. And so you were the only no vote, but you weren't the only person with reservations. But so I know you've only been in the Senate since 2013, but have things changed?
It feels like longer than that.
So me too. I think about last session when I was in the Senate and I saw the equal pay bill that Wendy Davis had sponsored with Senator Thompson in the House, and got to the Senate, and Donna Campbell, the Tea Party senator, ended up voting for it. I think about Senate Democrats using the 2/3 rule to insist on discussions about the drug testing for welfare benefits bill, which made it better, so everyone voted for it in the end. And some of the Democratic groups applauded, this approach to that reform. So have things gotten worse even in this short time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I really do think that. You can feel it even sometimes in the air in the lounge. You can feel it when you're walking around. I mean, it's almost, and for me, it seems like it's almost like right before we started the filibuster, when everybody was like, we were ready for the fight. And now that we're heading into the last 30 days, I'm beginning to feel that again. So I think it's going to be You know, for me, it's interesting because when you really think about it, the Tea Partiers have enough votes to block. If they would have kept the two-thirds rule, they'd probably been even more powerful as a bloc. But they went along with what the lieutenant governor wanted to do because that was always his highest priority. So it's becoming more and more partisan.
Would lawsuits against the redistricting plans help? It seems to me that if massive lawsuits were filed against these redistricting plans, you
Well,
may
we've
be
got
able to
one
get
still pending.
you may be able to get friendly judges in some of those cases to win some of those districts back. Because I mean, even on the left as well as the right, I live in Georgia now, where Cynthia McKinney was in an undefeatable seat. I mean, this is a certifiably crazy person, and she could get elected for as long as she wanted to, and they created her district to protect Newt Gingrich. So, I mean, they got to be lawsuits that you could file against those districts, and doing something like what California has done, which taken the redistricting thing out of the hands of the legislators and put it in the hands of academics and demographers that know something about creating districts that make sense rather than that pander to one political ideology.
You know, I want to follow up on that, and it probably makes a good transition for me to leave thereafter.
Yes.
I mean, the caucus that I chair has been in its 5th year suing the state of Texas on redistricting, and we are now maybe in our 4th year of suing the state of Texas on voter ID. And I will say, you know, my takeaways from this is that in voting rights, technology is outpacing the law. And what I mean by that is that I can now take a computer program down to your block. I can tell you how you vote. And I can draw a district that makes it look like you're a 51% Hispanic district, but you don't vote like one. And so 9 times out of 10, I will predict a race. I can look back at election runs over the course of a decade, and I can predict with certainty how many times a minority candidate would win if they were the choice of the minority community. And that's exactly what's happening. They're drawing districts that they give you the mirror image that they're minority opportunity districts, but they never perform like one. And so then instead of looking at the way the district is drawn, they take the anger out on the folks who live there, saying you're not voting. Well, we know that you're not going to win even if you voted. I mean, that's what's going on in redistricting. And so now that you've lost Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which now has paralyzed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, we simply now have only Section 2 and the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution to take up our voting rights claims, and that justice is moving really slow. We're in year 5. By the time we receive relief, we will be redrawing these districts. And when my caucus that, you know, impressively raises about $1 million a year has to combat Ken Paxton, who has your credit card, has a credit card with your name on it and can spend whatever he wants, that's my fight. And so when I'm encouraged when I see groups say that they need to get more involved in helping, you know, minority legal voting rights groups get through this process, that's encouraging. But we are in the Fifth Circuit. We are in the Fifth Circuit. And I was surprised, I think I fell out of my chair when I saw that the panel that was drawn for voter ID, which will be going before, you know, there'll be argument any day now, is a panel of 3 judges, 2 of them appointed by a Democratic president, 1 appointed by a Republican president. And so I have some hope that in the voter ID litigation that we may see some fair relief. But I will say, though, that is, you know, we are playing this game, but I think the deck is stacked against us because we don't have the resource capacity to compete with the state. The state knows they can drag this out and win elections now we'll be going into our 3rd election cycle under maps that aren't the permanent maps. And so when minorities get the break, it might be time to redraw the districts. And so when someone says to me, well, let's let somebody else draw these districts, let's get these academics and these pure folks, they're going to get appointed by somebody. They're not going to get pulled out of a lottery hat. They're going to have a political bent. And I always tell people, I say, you know, you all have been screwing in minorities for a long time, and now you're going to give us the keys, you know, to the government, And now you want to go to a commission. Now, all of a sudden, you know, the politicians can't draw these districts anymore. I mean, like, hey, listen, you've run this system of government. It may not be perfect, but you've run it this way for a very long time. Folks like me and my contemporaries have an opportunity to govern too. And so if anyone's going to change the rules, we're going to change the rules. You know, this is not the state that it once was. And so I think that in terms of having this, you know, level of fight, I think that this is how, what I tell people all the time, I get asked every day, every speaking event that I go to all over the country, what is the single largest issue that impacts the Hispanic community? What is that issue? Is it more education? Is it health care? Is it a better job? And what I tell them all the time without blinking, the largest issue that confronts the Hispanic community is that we're 38% of the population in Texas and we don't act like it. And the minute we start acting like we're 38% of the population, this education issue gets worked out. Healthcare issue gets worked out. Having a better job will get worked out. I promise you. It's that we have to start acting like we're 38% of the population. We have to start voting like we're 38% of the population. We have to start litigating in federal court like we have a seat at this table. And this is like the most encouraging, you know, way for me to start my weekend is to know that folks have been doing it far before me, and in some instances a much better way. And you know, I appreciate getting the opportunity to observe and learn from some legends and some current legends in the Senate. So thank you.
Well, he's leaving, but what did you make of his approach? I mean, you sued Ben Barnes over district maps.
Beg pardon?
You sued Ben Barnes over district maps. So, can you tell us just about how that was, or what that experience was like, what it produced?
By the time it was resolved, it was too late, and that's the way it always is. And I think I won that case. And it was about the way the district was drawn in Houston. And it's an interesting thing, if it had not been for gerrymandering, I would have been a member of the state Senate, because I was kind of lined up to go to the Senate. And Barbara Jordan was the chairman of the redistricting committee in the state Senate, and she drew a district that had River Oaks and a finger coming down. It picked up my house. So I was essentially would be representing River Oaks. And, you know, that dog don't hunt. So it was impossible for me to run for the state Senate. And that's the reason I ran for Congress. And the interesting thing about that congressional race was that I carried the black community and the Hispanic community, but the district was almost 60% white, and I did not carry anything hardly in the white community. And history proved what it went the other way. So I probably, had the district been more adequately drawn, I probably would have gone to the Congress that time, because Barbara had not endeared herself to the black community at all. I carried the black community in that district.
So if you guys had the opportunity to make a couple of tweaks to the way state government and state elections work, what would be on the top of your priorities?
To elections or?
Elections or state government?
Oh, I think the key is more access to the ballot box. I mean, I totally agree with what Representative Martinez Fischer said in terms of we as a population, in terms of Latinos, will not be where we need to be with the until we get that voting strength. But if you looked at all the barriers that are put there, I mean, yesterday we debated a bill that Senator Perry's carrying about this match with other states and all those things that they start doing, whether it's voter ID or, you know, they restrict the deputy voter, who can be a deputy voter registrar, you know, who can be trained, who can do this. So I made that a priority for my legislation this year, and I've got about 5 different kind of voter access, voter registration, online training as a deputy registrar. That finally got out of committee yesterday. because that's where it's at. It's all about the ballot box. And one thing I said on before yesterday, when we were debating Senator Perry's bill, is that, we're spending so much time trying to find ways to keep people off the voter rolls, and we should be spending all that time and money to get people on the voter rolls. We've got the worst voter participation rate in the country, and one of the worst voter registration rates in the country. And as I was walking off by the press table, they said, well, Senator, what did you, because he said, we like your testimony, can we have a copy of it? I said, look, I don't even want to talk about it. I said, all I want you to do is remember, the next time after election, and you ask me, why didn't Latinos turn out? Remember today, because this is nothing but an obstacle. When people get a letter saying that their voter registration will be suspended, people think that's serious. When they suspend their license, they can't drive. When their kids are suspended from school, they can't go to school. So when they're told you're in suspense, they think they can't vote. They'll forget about it. Been there, done that. I said, these are the things that keep people from voting. It scares them.
The very clever people have decided that if they can't win the elections fair, they'll steal them. And the way they're stealing them now in many states is through the criminal justice system. If I can get you convicted of a felony, no matter how small or minuscule or obscure that felony might be, it will stop you from voting. So you might be out reproducing us, but you won't outvote us ever, because we can see to it that you don't vote by having you convicted of a felony. Now, that's criminal, huh? That really is criminal, because once you've paid your time to society, there is no way that you should not be given the full rights of citizenship in this country. You look at that across the board, and it is in almost every state you see this thing creeping in, where they're going to steal the rights away from you if they can't stop you from voting in some kind of other way, and that's awful. That's really awful.
We'll open it to audience questions in just a minute. I'll ask maybe one more, and Chris, you might, if you guys are thinking of questions, we're about to start taking those. Let me, to follow up on that, ask about the 2014 election cycle. I thought, 2010 was not a year where Democrats were very excited going into the general election. They didn't even have a candidate for comptroller, so there was not huge turnout. And then in 2014, they had at least one candidate at the top of the ticket who had some national name ID and certainly statewide name ID. They had a full suite of candidates, some of whom were unusually good. Mike Collier, the comptroller candidate, still sort of a shadow comptroller, which is delightful. But turnout didn't really improve. I think in Travis County, you did see turnout effect, but across the state there, despite all the attention and the news coverage and the number of candidates and the fact that other groups started organizing in Texas, groups that have organized very well in other states, it was just flat or slightly, I don't remember in the end, was it flat as a share of registered voters? So how did you interpret that? Was that because of the new voter ID law, because of the confusion over eligibility?
To me, a lot of it, I think it's all of the above. When only 1 out of 3 people vote, and only one out of 4 that are eligible to register vote, Texas has nothing to brag about. We should just be ashamed of that. But again, it goes back to, we can't get our tax assessor to do early voting 7 to 7 on a weekend. For some reason, during the week, that first week, they only do it from, I think it's 9 to, was it 5 o'clock, Isabel?
1 to 5 on Sunday.
That's crazy. Again, it's meant so that working people who tend to be, for me, good Democrats, don't come out and vote. Who's got time to go during the day from 9 to 3 to go vote early? And we're one of the, we could be doing like Lubbock and a couple of other counties that do, the super precinct where you can vote anytime in any precinct all the time. It doesn't stop at the end of early voting. We could do something crazy like online voting. There's a lot of things that we can do and we don't do it. I think also we just got knocked out by more TV time. I mean, people just really rely on TV for a lot of their information, and they saturated the TV commercials early. They had so much more super PAC money coming in and different groups that, yes, Senator Davis was able to raise a lot of money, but she still couldn't effectively compete with the, 20, 40, how much did Abbott have, like 40 million?
He still has like 40 million because Dan Patrick's been running against him.
And he could have gotten more. So it goes back to the money that you were talking about that gets flooded, and this was a priority race for them, so they put all the money in there. The good news is that there's some parts of Harris County where we did increase the sort of like the occasional voter, the minority voter who doesn't vote all the time. I mean, in some pockets, some of those numbers went up. But it wasn't enough to win all the ballot, but it was enough to keep some of our judges. So, we'll just build from that. But we've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of it has to do with, again, removing all those barriers to access to the voter registration and access to the ballot box and access to just voting. I want you all to know that even I was stopped. Not only when I went over there to vote, I mean, the precinct judge actually followed me to my car to come tell me that my vote hadn't registered, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I didn't know how to vote. And I actually looked at her and I said, ma'am, I have been voting since I was eligible to vote, and I voted every single election. She says, well, ma'am, you just don't know how to use the machines. You need to come back in because your vote didn't register.
Wow.
And I had to go back in, and I had gone in with about 2 or 3 seniors that I had picked up from a community center, and I found by complaining they never did anything with it. And to me, it was just pure harassment that had carried over from the weekend before, because we'd had an event where the judge had gone into a little, I hate to use the good Texas language, but in a pissing match with our own sheriff about whether or not the event that we were doing was far away from the voting location, because we were doing a Get Out the Vote event. We'd all set up, music, chairs, everything, and they come and say, oh, no, you're too close to the voting booth. And our sheriff happened to be there and walked it with him and says, no, they're within the, what was it, is it about 100 yards, is it?
1,000 people.
Yeah. And he says, look, I'll walk it with you. And she says, no, y'all have to move. And we say, we can't move a stage and chairs and food and music. So then they brought out a measuring tape. Then they called the TV on us and a couple of people to videotape us. And then, so I think it just kind of, and she knew who I was. But so it was pure harassment in my view. And all you do is you call the tax assessor, you make the complaint, and then you get a call back, and, well, we're going to look into it. But right now, they control every election, at least for the next 4 years. Because
well, let me make you feel good. In
let
Georgia,
me feel good.
Yeah, let me make you feel good. In Georgia, it took me 5 hours to get my driver's license renewed. 5 hours, because they don't want you to have a picture ID. So people walked in that office and stood there for 2 and 3 hours and said, I can't take this any longer, and they left. I made friends with those people, lifelong friends, because I was in the line for 5 hours waiting to just get a driver's. I had to bring my passport, Fruit of the Looms or jockeys. I had to bring everything in order to get a driver's license. Then I showed up at the polls the first time to vote for Barack, and I waited 6 hours to vote. The second time, I waited 4 hours to vote, to the point where I was getting handicapped people out of the line, going to the precinct judge and saying, you got to do something for this person because they can't stand anymore. And what they did in our poll was, it's all done by computer. They reduced the number of computers. Mm-hmm. So there were 3 computers for thousands of people who were trying to vote at that precinct. And it was deliberate. It was absolutely deliberate. And I mean, I'm in an Atlanta suburb, so the registrar of voters, the Secretary of State's office is close by, and the person who was running it for the state came by, and I said, This is criminal. Somebody ought to do something about this. I'm going to call the press, because there's a reason why on the other side of town they got all the computers they want. And on our side, they have 3 computers for these thousands of people who are wrapped around the block to try to vote. So
And
they're
that
going to
happens
find
in
one
many
way or the
cases.
other to stop you from exercising your constitutional right to be a citizen in this country.
We see that happen in a lot of precincts, particularly the low voter turnout precincts and the precincts that have more minorities or Spanish language voters. We see people wanting to cast their ballot but need information or assistance, and they're being denied that. They don't have Spanish language interpreters. Sometimes when I'm voting, I end up being an interpreter because I overhear what's going on. So these things are happening, and that's what's keeping people from voting. So none of these things will change, and he's absolutely right. Once we get more votes out there and become the power that we are, then all those things can be changed, but it's going to take some time. We've got a lot of work to do.
Well, it'll be interesting. Concurrently, I feel like I can't go a day lately without some Republican conservative legislator or person taking me aside and saying, we need to get more voters in the primary, we need more voters in the primary, because I think from their point of view, they see the primaries, yielding this set of some of the Tea Partiers who are now in the ledge and now, have eaten the establishment and are even further down the line. Chris, do you have a last question?
Yeah, on that note, I mean, in your time dealing with these laws governing voter registration and ballot access, are there measures, no matter how small, that you think might have buy-in from Republicans? Is there anything that you think that might have buy-in from Republicans in the legislature right now?
Well, actually, there's a bill that the House sponsor is Dennis Bonham, I'm the Senate sponsor, and it's to be able to take your cell phone with voter information to the voter ballot box area. Not to use it, not to take a picture, but to be able to rely on that. I know he's gotten it out. I haven't even gotten a hearing, but I'm pressing to get one. The online training for deputy registrar, I've gotten it out of the committee, and it's out on who's carrying it on the other side? Isabel, my assistant's over there. So it's moving over there, and I think that one was originally carried by a Republican. I don't know if she still is. So I think there's some things that there is buy-in, but they're small, but every incremental step helps. And just to finish my story, y'all, I did go back. They even took me to a machine that wasn't mine, and then they took me back to the machine where I was, and there apparently was a hiccup with the machine, but it was none of my doing, and I had to recast my vote, and my vote did go in there. So, but these things happen.
We'll take audience questions. I think I saw it. All right.
John, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure, please do, Joe.
So earlier in the last panel, we heard, I guess, Professor Galbraith made reference to how over time the small dissident voice that if you're registering something like for disarmament or for peace, may be reaching ears that you don't expect it to reach. And the point was made about Reagan or about McNamara, people in positions of power actually taking those words into consideration when they are making their decisions, even though they might not appear to be part of the same coalition per se. We've talked a lot, Trey made some great points about procedurally how a minority operates in a legislative body, but just rhetorically or just in the realm of ideas, how do you all feel like when you're in the vast minority and you speak up on something, what sort of reaction do you see in your colleagues on the other side? And can you cite any instances where you feel like you've made some inroads or at least some sort of consideration on their part?
I've done better with it one-on-one, talking about a bill or a particular issue. And I had one of my colleagues to the right of me in one of the committee hearings the other day who, much to my surprise, just kind of leaned over and says, I'm really glad you're here. And I said, I've got perfect attendance on this committee. And he goes, no, but I mean, I really like hearing your perspective. And I just smiled and said, well, why don't you vote with me more often? And he said, no, and I did. And he actually ended up voting for one of my bills that just got out. It's called a community schools bill. And it's an alternative to intervention when schools are non-performing. But he actually had listened, and then I visited with him, and he said, so that really is to help the non-performing schools? I said, yes. And they can do this. They've got to get parent participation. They've got to get faculty. I went through, and he goes, okay, well, I'm going to think about it. And then he actually said to me, I'm so glad you're here. He said, because I never would have learned about that. And it's true, because if you look at his background and where he lives, he probably has never visited a minority non-performing school. And that's the trick. And you know, Phil Graham, of all people, came and testified at education. I don't know if you all saw it. You know, and at first, I was going to be very respectful, and I had already told some of one of my colleagues that's also a Democrat on the committee, you know, he's just an older man now. He's, you know, I'm going to leave him alone. I'm not going to ask him anything. Let me just hear him out. Well, of course, he said something on that, outrageous, and I had to step in. And finally, I just said something. I said, you know, Senator Graham, I really wasn't going to ask you any questions because, you know, out of respect to you and your position, and, you know, you've got a right to your views, but just tell me, when was the last time you really visited a minority school? Because he kept talking about minority schools and non-performers. It's just like they're the same thing. And he just says, well, you know, I don't think I've been to any school in any time recently, and everybody started laughing. But it kind of diffused his whole argument because he was talking like he knew everything about non-performing minority schools and that they were all one and the same, but he hasn't been to one. So sometimes even if you know, quietly, either one-on-one or in committee, point these things out, I mean, I think they do listen a little bit. But they've got a scorecard they've got to worry about, and that's the problem.
I use trickery.
I'm going to take some lessons from him.
Trickery works every time. I had a bill to create subsidies for children who were hard to adopt. And because, you know, the pretty little white children can be adopted like that. But if you're a minority child or a handicapped child, you would probably stay in foster situation or whatever the situation might be for a long time or never be adopted. So I passed a bill that allowed the state to subsidize the adoption of hard-to-place children. But I defined what hard-to-place was, and I defined it as a racial minority or a handicapped child. Well, I knew that I was toxic because I viewed my role in the legislature not necessarily as a legislator, but rather as an educator, because I needed to educate the state and the people about the things that were going wrong. So if I would introduce that bill before, I may not even be able to get a hearing before committee. So I found Billy, whatever that guy's name was, from Tyler, Texas. He looked like a short Johnny Cash. He wore black outfits all the time and a shoestring tie. Billy what?
Williamson.
Billy Williamson. I found Billy Williamson because he had adopted a handicapped child. And I went to Billy quietly, not on the floor, but in his office, and I said, you know, there's a shame that handicapped children are not being adopted. Well, Billy Williamson had never spoken to me before because he didn't speak to black people. And I convinced him that he should carry this bill and that I wanted nothing to do with it. And this had only to do with helping handicapped children. And he introduced the damn bill and passed it. Huh? Now that's straight out trickery. I knew what I was doing, and I got it done. And there were several bills that I got passed just like that. You never probably heard about the Clean Crapper bill, did you?
Clean Crapper bill, no, sir.
Okay. prior to me being in the legislature, there was no standards for restrooms in places, in public places in the state. If you opened up a bar, you could put a piece of tin behind the bar, and that was where you peed. You could do anything. You could call it a restroom. Okay. So I thought that there should be some kind of minimal standards for sanitation for restrooms in restaurants. And
I think we should all thank him right now.
I passed the clean crapper bill. And again, I can't remember the guy's name who I got to help me with it, but he was a restaurateur. And he had a clean crapper. And I said, everybody should have a clean crapper. You should have a place to wash your hands. You should have a commode that is clean. And I got him to pass the clean crapper bill. And I think it was Neil Caldwell who drew a cartoon of me. And he called me in the cartoon the grand dame, or the grand man of clean crappers for the state of Texas. So the reason that you have minimal standards in bathrooms in this state is my clean crapper bill.
Thank you. Now, I know nobody can top that.
Progress happens over time. Any questions from the audience, or we've got, sir?
We all know that Bob Bullock put in the Constitution something that enables us to pass an income tax in Texas and devote the proceeds to reduction of property taxes and to education. And that would produce, obviously, more revenue. I'm wondering, does the Democratic Party and our caucuses in the House and the Senate ever think about going to the people of Texas and saying, we'd like to reduce your property taxes, we'd like to make your education system better, and this is how we're going to do it. And the opposition party in this state doesn't want decent education or to reduce your property taxes. Now, is there ever any thought of that among the Democratic Party as a whole, or the Democratic caucuses in the Senate and the House of Representatives of the state of Texas today?
Well, I think our focus really has just been about saving public education. I can tell you that it is just so disheartening every time our education committee meets, because there just seems to be such a sentiment to try to just undo, totally unfund public education and put all the dollars into charter schools and private schools. That it's really just been the fight is to just protect our public schools and get them the resources that they need and to stop the diversion. So, I must admit we've never quite focused on what you're talking about, because it's really just a question of survival for the schools right now. When you've got members of the Education Committee tweeting, we've got to stop this bureaucracy of schools and government schools and calling them all kinds of names. I mean, it's just not very, very conducive to really doing much more than just protect what we've got and try to keep as many of the dollars as we can.
Education may be one of the pivotal things that if somebody would make a case to conservatives that it's stupid to make college education so expensive until the average person cannot go, therefore we are wasting this talent, therefore we're going to have to get engineers and physicians and everybody else from someplace else in the world to do our engineering and our medical work and everything else. If somebody doesn't convince conservatives that it is in their best interest to bring down the cost of college education. I have a grandson who's about to go to Duke right now. My son called me to tell me it's going to cost $64,000. That's awful. It's going to cost $64,000 per year. That's like buying a Rolls Royce every year almost. I mean, this is unbelievable what education is costing. And there was a time when states kept the cost of education down. Every state now is raising the cost of the state colleges and universities in their state. And that's counterproductive to our nation, because we're not going to produce enough intellectual talent to keep ourselves going if we keep making the expenses for college education so high.
Anybody else?
All right, well, great. Yes, ma'am.
Very naive question, but the crapper story and the handicap story, and then the story about the person on the committee with you. Nobody's reading each other's bills. I know I'm really naive to ask this question, but isn't that a problem? I mean, would there be people working together more? Obviously, there's common interest in the bills that are being submitted, but nobody knows that.
No, people are reading the bills. Our bills just have different goals. I mean, if my colleague's bill is to, a voucher program that is meant to put money into a private school, and that goal is very different than mine that's trying to restore the cuts from 2 sessions ago. So we're reading each other's bills. We just don't agree. And there's really, these days, there seems to be very little that for the big picture things that are out there, that we can agree on. If it's a local bill, if it's a sort of a regional bill, we'll support our colleagues. I mean, if the Dallas Turnpike Authority needs something, and it's something that's within the regular structure of things, I mean, I'm going to support that bill and vote for it out of my committee, because I know when I'm going to go in there about a management district about in my area, I'm going to need that vote too. So on local bills, we agree. It's all those other things and they're the big ones that impact people's lives every single day. This session is just going to, in my view, is going to make poor people poorer, and we're going to increase the uninsured rolls. That's what we're going to do, and we're going to end up with more children that are not going to get pre-K, that are not going to get fed, and they're not going to be able to get the school attention that they need, because we're shifting so many dollars under 3, 4, 5 different versions of vouchers that they want to pass. So it's becoming going to be more and more difficult.
This has to do with gender in the legislature. When Sissy was in the legislature, she and Barbara Jordan were the only 2 women there. And now, over 40 years later, there are only 20% women in the legislature. It seems to me if there were more women, that we might be having fewer problems with women's health issue with bad legislation being passed. But now, if every woman in the legislature stood together on something, they by themselves couldn't get it passed. So I'm wondering about your insights about what it's going to take to get more women.
Well, I think what's important is that we get women, but women that are progressive women, because the truth is we do have, more, I guess, one more a member of the Senate, but it's only 2 Democratic women, and I don't think I can get my 5 other colleagues to agree on too much with me. Some of them were not there when we needed their vote for equal pay. I did recently get them all agreed, and they signed on as co-authors of my bill on revenge pornography. But I really had to sit down and visit with them one-on-one and explain to them what it was. And I'm pleased to report that on that one, all the women of the Senate did sign up on my bill, and that's one bill that I have gotten out. So that's like one little glimmer of hope for women. But it's hard because we just can't elect women. We got to make sure that they're women that are committed to the issues that matter to everyday Texans. And it is about health care. It is about reproductive rights. It is about equal pay. It is about pre-K. It is about daycare and good quality daycare. And not all women do that. I mean, I saw some of my women colleagues last time vote against the breakfast program for kids. I mean, that is disheartening, y'all. But again, a lot of it goes back to the scorecards. You know, if their allies tell them that's not a vote they should take, they don't do it. So, I've been about electing women since I watched Sissy Farenthold on TV. And, you know, I forgot to mention that she was also nominated for Vice President of the United States. And, you know, I've watched women and been at many conventions to support women for office, but we got to make sure it's women that are willing to stand up and speak for us and do the right things.
Let me address it in another way. Clarence Thomas. Need I say more? If you don't elect the right people, it doesn't really matter. Thurgood Marshall once said, black snake, white snake, it's still a snake. So if you don't elect progressive women, it would do no good. I mean, she's just saying exactly the same thing. If you can't get them to vote on something as significant as this, it makes no difference whether they are female or male. It really doesn't.
We need to look at what the barriers to entry into a race are, because we can't elect women, progressive or non, if they're not running. All goes back to gender roles, opportunities as women, and it goes into campaign financing and what you even need to do to get in the door. Because I know many women who have great ideas on issues that matter to everyday Texans and Americans generally, and are pretty much in line with what we all know is right and is common sense. But they don't run because they have other priorities, because it's not worth it to them. The pain, the trouble, the time, the money, the personal sacrifice, it's not worth it. So how do we make it worth it to women?
Well, I think what we have to do is demonstrate that we make a difference and that being here does matter, that we have a voice. And I still got up and talked about pre-K when I voted no, because it needed to be said that there was no pre-K funding. So I think it's about being a voice and knowing that you're not going to win every battle, but you got to pick up your britches and keep going. I try to stay positive as much as I can, and sometimes my staff thinks I'm crazy, because I'll actually walk in and just say, hey, you know, let's go after it. You know, just remember when you first came to the Capitol as a child to visit, did you ever think you would be working here? And more importantly, that you would work in the Senate? And that we can make a difference for people every day? Because it does count. So I think people just need to, especially women, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You know, you got to try it. You shouldn't have a regret one day that you should have run for office. Go ahead and go. Trust me, the men don't think about it twice. If they set their minds to run, they do it. We need to stop trying to second guess our own strengths and our own abilities and go for it. Thank you.
Shut it down.
All right. Yeah. I wasn't sure if that was general applause or applause for the last comment, but let's have another round of general applause for our great panelists, including